This is a story from a very dark time in England. It takes place during the reign of the infamous King John, whom some people call the worst English king ever. This is the same King John who wore the crown supposedly when Robin Hood was busy stealing from the rich to feed the poor, because it was a really tough time for everyone. And not only because King John was king. Even prior to this guy wearing the crown, England had experienced decades of rebellions, wars, and civil wars. And those are very expensive for ordinary people. We're talking about a situation in which peasants are pushed off their land or starving, and even the aristocracy is suffering severe financial hardship and sometimes much worse penalties. Today's story is a story of a woman who was remarkable for her generation. A woman who was called manly by her contemporaries for demonstrating the virtues that were normally expected of knights. And we're going to look at this period through her eyes, because normally history is written through the eyes of kings. And while that's a very interesting perspective, it's a distinctly minority report. So today, we're going to look at this very dark chapter of English history through the eyes of someone a little more ordinary in rank, but extraordinary in courage. You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is a very special bonus episode on the life of Lady Nicola de Haye. Nicola de Haye is born in 1150, or squarely in the middle of the 12th century. So let's take a moment to appreciate what's going on in England at this time. First of all, England looks nothing like the country we know today. In the previous century, England was invaded by the Normans in 1066, and they completely transformed court culture in England. First of all, they spoke French. Secondly, they came from Normandy, which is located in what is now mainland France. So you basically have a totally imported new noble class with kings chosen from their own ranks. And they displaced the existing Anglo-Saxon noble families, who were now no longer first rank aristocracy. This is a country where English is spoken by everyday people, French is the preferred language of the noble classes, and Latin is the language of the church and law, along with French. It is also an era where England and France have a very complicated relationship, because the King of England is also the Duke of Normandy. That's where the Normans had come from. It was the Duke of Normandy, William, who had invaded England and become its king, transforming himself from William, Duke of Normandy, to William the Conqueror, King of England. But he still kept his lands in Normandy, which he held under the authority of the King of France. So the kings of England in this period are also the Dukes of Normandy, and that means they have land on both sides of the English Channel. It also means that there's constant travel back and forth as these kings sometimes spend time in England and sometimes hold court or conduct their activities in their ancestral homelands of Normandy. In this period of the 12th century, or the High Middle Ages, England is an intensely hierarchical society. People are ruled by what you can think of as twin pyramids. There's the pyramid of royal authority, with the king at the top, the aristocrats in the top tier, and then the king's officials, his sheriffs, his judges, his law enforcers, his knights. And these are the people who control the land and the power politically. But there's another pyramid, and that is the pyramid of ecclesiastical or church power, which has the Pope at the top of the pyramid and has descending underneath him archbishops, bishops, and all the way down to your local monks and priests in everyday communities. And so for ordinary people, they were subject to both of these pyramids. The church pyramid was one they paid taxes to, and they looked to for authority in spiritual matters and religious practice. And the king's pyramid was the one they had to deal with more taxes, as well as who owned the land and made the wars and the laws and so on. Of course, these two pyramids were often in conflict with each other, and the story of the Middle Ages is one where there are constant contests of authority between heads of state and church officials over who has the deciding vote on various matters. So it wasn't necessarily a peaceable arrangement, but it was a mutually reinforcing structure of authority most of the time. Nicola de la Haye is born into a reasonably wealthy landowning family in a place called Lincoln, which is in the East Midlands of England. Her grandfather had been the keeper of Lincoln Castle, which was an official position that was hereditary, so after he gained this important post, he passed it on to his son, Nicola's father. When Nicola's father dies, he dies without sons. And so this means that he parcels out his land holdings amongst his 3 daughters. And Nicola, as the eldest, at the age of 19, inherits this hereditary post of the keeper of Lincoln Castle. In addition to this job, she also had her own parcel of land that she inherited from her father, along with the serfs who worked that land and the revenue that they generated. So this is how Nicola and her family support themselves, is through the revenues gained off the land that they own. So Nicola marries, as she was expected to, and this hereditary position of the keeper of Lincoln Castle, which is hers by inheritance, is then shared with her husband. We don't know much about the situation in her first marriage, only that that husband died fairly early, leaving Nicola with a surviving daughter of that union. We know a lot more about her second husband, whom she married at the age of 30, and his name was Gerard de Conville, or, if you prefer a more anglicized version, Gerard de Canville. At the time that Nicola makes this important second marriage, there are momentous things going on in the country at large. They've just crowned a new king. His name is Richard I, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. Now, Richard was the son of Henry II, or Henry Plantagenet, who was the founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. And this is a king that we've talked a fair amount about on this podcast, particularly in a couple of episodes we did recently on the Archbishop Thomas Becket and his unfortunate falling out with King Henry II. Henry II marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, who, by the way, was the former Queen of France, but she divorced that king and married Henry, and then he became the King of England. So Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II found the Plantagenet dynasty in England, and they have a whole parcel of sons and daughters. Richard is actually the 3rd son of this marriage, but his 2 older brothers are already dead at this point, so by the time his father, Henry II, dies, Richard is going to inherit the crown. So Nicola and her husband Gerard are seeking a royal grant from their new king Richard, basically confirming their existing land holdings. And of course, they were going to pay a handsome fee for this. Now, why was this necessary? Well, remember, we're living in the Middle Ages, and this is a feudal society. So any land that any noble family owns, quote unquote, is basically granted to them at the king's good pleasure, and he can confiscate that land from them at any time if he thinks that that's appropriate. So when there's a change of king, Nicola and her husband are looking for the new king to confirm the property that she and her husband have already been holding, and basically to rubber stamp that with his authority and say, yes, I recognize these lands are in your keeping. With my authority as the king, I'm happy for you to continue to hold this property. Richard's charging nobles fees for this kind of royal rubber stamp was a revenue-generating exercise. He was actually looking to raise money, and this is because he had a lot of bills that were going to be coming up. Richard the Lionheart is about to make his reputation by going off on the Third Crusade, and that's where he gets the title Lionheart. These wars are very expensive. Richard needs to raise some cash, and that's why he's come up with this idea of having all the nobles of England line up and basically have him rubber stamp their possessions and pay him a fee for this. Richard is reported to have said at around this time that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. So this is a king in need of cash, and Nicola and Gerard are caught up in this moment where they're getting his royal rubber stamp, and paying him for the privilege. Richard then disappears from England in 1190 to go off on the Third Crusade. And this is an adventure that's going to prevent his return home for 4 years. 4 years is a long time for any king to be gone, and someone is going to have to keep things running in the country while he's away. So King Richard appoints a guy called Bishop William de Longchamp of Ely. And this guy is going to be the Chancellor of England, basically the king's right-hand man, the man who takes the king's desires and turns them into policies. Bishop Longchamp is going to be effectively ruling in the king's name. He has the king's authority to make whatever executive decisions he needs to make, whether it's financially or politically, to keep the country working while King Richard is away. Bishop Longchamp quickly made himself extremely unpopular with the nobles of England. And this is partly because hating the king is treasonous, but hating his contemptible, lame little servant is a lot easier to do and entirely forgivable. So not all of the hatred directed at Bishop Longchamp was entirely his fault. After all, he was charged with doing some very unpopular things, like continuing to raise money and basically tax the nobles in England continuously to send funds over to King Richard for the things that he needed. But Bishop Longchamp did earn some of the hatred that came his way on his own account as well. And that's because he was widely seen as very extravagant. So Bishop Longchamp would be going across the country with this enormous retinue of people, and then expecting nobles in the castles or the manor houses along the way to basically foot the bill and feed all of these people and put them up and entertain them. So this made him very unpopular very quickly. To make matters worse, Bishop Longchamp was from Normandy directly, so he spoke French, and he didn't care to even attempt speaking English to anybody. So while a lot of the aristocracy in England had originally come from Normandy, they'd now been in England for nearly a century. So that meant that they had largely begun to assimilate. They understood English, they'd intermixed with the local people, they were now as much English as they were Norman. But Bishop Longchamp came directly from Normandy, and he didn't care at all for anything that he deemed English, because to him that was inferior. So it's not hard to see how a man with an attitude like this would make himself extremely unpopular. So we're in a situation where King Richard is far, far away. The country is being run by this enormously unpopular Chancellor Longchamp. And the English nobility are extremely upset by what they deem to be incredible levels of taxation combined with arbitrary extra expenses whenever Mr. Lord Chancellor tends to show up in their neighborhood. Add to this mix the king's younger brother, Prince John, sometimes called John Lackland, because as the youngest son of the Plantagenet dynasty, the portion of land reserved for him to inherit was really very small indeed. But this was a situation that Prince John was looking to remedy, and he saw an opportunity at this moment. His older brother Richard was far, far away, and there was at least a 50% chance that he would never make it back. I mean, after all, crusades were wars. They were quite dangerous. There was always the chance that Richard would succumb to a battle injury or a mysterious foreign illness and never actually come home. In the meantime, Prince John was looking for opportunities to increase his own status and influence with noble families in England. And so he sees this moment as King Richard's chancellor is extremely unpopular. There's a lot of resentment amongst the nobles. He sees it as an opportunity. So Prince John is very happy to commiserate with nobles, including Nicola and her husband Gerard, saying, "Oh, it's terribly unfair what this chancellor is doing. The effrontery of this man to bring his 1,000-person retinue through your lands and expect you to pay for a fancy dinner. This is ridiculous. It's unjust. I would never allow such a thing." Very quickly, Prince John is leading a rebellion against the authority of Chancellor Longchamp. And this is something that a lot of nobles jump on, including Gerard de Conville, Nicola's husband. So Gerard actually formally rejects the authority of Chancellor Longchamp. He basically says, I don't recognize you, you're unjust, the things you're doing are unreasonable, I'm not going to obey you anymore. And instead, Gerard swears a feudal loyalty oath to Prince John. So he's saying, John is the rightful authority, this prince is the one I'm going to obey and recognize, not the Chancellor. So when Chancellor Longchamp hears about this, he says to Gerard basically, okay, you're fired. So Gerard had a post as Sheriff of Lincolnshire, which was the city and town around Lincoln Castle. And the Chancellor says, well, you're fired from that. You're no longer in that job. And he also demands that Gerard and Nicola hand over Lincoln Castle. You're no longer the keepers of this castle either then. Now, you might think that holding a castle wasn't a particularly important thing, perhaps, but you'd be wrong. Castles were extremely expensive to construct, and they were erected because they were extremely important strategic fortresses. So they were erected at various points where you needed to muster troops or defend a border, and the person who was keeping that castle was basically in charge of using it as an outpost for security reasons. So it was a very important role. You wanted somebody in that role who was both competent and loyal to the crown. Because if the person holding that castle decided to go to the enemy side, for example, the French side, and you as the English king lost control of that castle, that could tip the balance of a war. So it was, in fact, a very important position, and it's no small thing that Nicola is now being asked to give up something that's been in her family for 3 generations. Gerard and Nicola are in no mood to listen to any of the demands coming from the mouth of Chancellor Longchamp, who they have no love for anyway, and whose authority they've already rejected. So they don't pay any attention to this demand. In fact, Gerard, with his new best friend, Prince John, goes and lays siege to another couple of castles. And they leave Nicola in charge of Lincoln Castle, knowing very well that that castle is likely to be attacked by forces sent by the Chancellor. It surprised nobody when the Chancellor sent a few hundred men, many of whom were professional soldiers, to besiege the castle of Lincoln and take it by force. So Nicola is inside the castle. She has her garrison of men that normally man the walls, and she supervises the defense of that castle when it's attacked by the Chancellor's forces. We know that Gerard was completely confident in his wife's ability to supervise effectively the defense of this important castle. He said so publicly, and the fact that he left the castle in her keeping and rode off without any concern is a very strong sign of his confidence in her abilities. We know a lot less about what Nicola thought of her husband Gerard's political activities. Did the two of them have political conversations? Did she agree with his decision to repudiate the Chancellor and to support Prince John in a rebellion? These things were very risky. If you back the wrong side, you can lose everything. And so Gerard, and to some extent Nicola, are betting that Prince John is going to be the right candidate, and that by supporting him and befriending him, they're betting on the right side of power. If they get it wrong, they've made an enemy of Chancellor Longchamp, who represents King Richard. So they're now in an opposition to those forces, and they'd better hope they pick the right side. Whatever Nicola thought of her husband's political ideas, it seems unlikely that she had any complicated feelings about defending a castle that had been in her family for several generations. To her, there was a very strong personal element in defending and retaining the keeping of this castle. A source writing at the time that this was going on says, quote, "Putting aside her womanly instincts, she defended the castle like a man," unquote. This is the highest possible praise for a woman in the Middle Ages charged with doing a job that would normally be seen as a man's duty. And Nicola doesn't just defend the castle for a few days. She successfully defends it under a siege that lasted more than a month. Now, this may sound to you like Nicola is getting more credit than she deserves. I mean, after all, was she on the wall shooting arrows personally? Doesn't credit rightfully belong to the men who are actually on the walls throwing projectiles, shooting arrows, and in other ways trying to repel the attackers? Of course, you couldn't defend any castle without a garrison of men who were dedicated to the task. But here's the tricky part. The men who are defending a castle need to have complete confidence in the wisdom of their leadership. If they don't, they might decide to make their own terms with the enemy. Because how sieges on castles generally worked was this. The attacking army would roll up to the walls, and they would demand that you surrender. So now the person in charge of the castle, or the commander, would be in charge of sending messages to the leader of the attacking army. The attacking army typically would make an offer like, if you surrender now, you can leave and we're not going to hurt anybody. But the implicit threat, and sometimes the very explicit threat, was, if you don't surrender now, you're going to pay a very high price for your defiance. So the men in that castle who are going to be manning the walls have to believe that their commander is making the right decision, and that that decision is informed by a thorough grasp of what the food supplies in the castle are, how well defended and how secure the walls are, whether or not those walls have been fortified or will crumble easily in certain places if they're battered. Because if that commander makes the wrong decision and says, no, we're not surrendering, and then the attacking army manages to invade by force, very frequently the defenders would pay with their lives. So a commander who says, no, we're holding this castle, is now committing the defenders to a very high-stakes siege, one which, if they lose, could be the end of life for many of them. Generally, the attackers in a siege of a castle are trying to intimidate the defenders and starve them into submission. Basically make them believe you have no hope, no one is coming to help you, if you don't surrender you're all going to die of starvation, so you might as well just give up. Meanwhile, the defenders of a castle are trying to hold out long enough so that the attacking army finds that it's too expensive and too exhausting to continue a siege. Remember, if you're going to roll up outside the walls of a castle with an army, you're basically committing all of your guys to be camping outside in whatever the weather is for weeks or months at a time. And you also have to feed these people. Often in a landscape where the defenders have done their very best to poison the available water supplies and eliminate standing food or crops that might be around. So it's going to be expensive and risky for you to keep those men in the field surrounding a castle and maintaining a siege. So it's a game, a very bloody game, to see who gives up first. And there are other situations in the medieval period where women have been in charge of defending castles against attackers. We looked at an example like this in another bonus episode we did on the life of Raymond of Antioch. In this example, Princess Alice was trying to hold the city of Antioch in the Near East against her own father, the king of Jerusalem. So the king rolled up with his armies at the gates of Antioch. Alice said, we're not yielding, we're keeping the gates closed. And then the men of her garrison betrayed her because they had more faith in the king of Jerusalem than they did in her. And without the support of the garrison who were in charge of defending Antioch, there was no one to hold the gates. The men just opened the gates up, the king of Jerusalem came in, and Alice's battle was lost. So it was by no means a given that the men in a garrison were going to support just whoever happened to be in charge of that city or that fortified castle. The fact that Alice manages to hold the castle of Lincoln for more than a month is a testimony to the confidence of the men working under her. They believed she knew what she was doing and that she wasn't guiding them into disaster. And as things turned out, their confidence in her was entirely justified. By July of 1191, a truce was made between the rebels, led by Prince John and his supporters like Nicola's husband Gerard, and Bishop Longchamp, the Chancellor of England. And one of the terms of this truce was that Nicola and her husband got to keep the Castle of Lincoln, that the demand that they were going to give that up would be withdrawn, and their status there would be continued. So Nicola and her family are now allied with Prince John, but this is going to come back to haunt them in 1194, because that is when Richard the Lionheart returns to England after his extended stay abroad. Even after the Third Crusade had wrapped up, Richard had been delayed for some period of time in the Holy Roman Empire as he was held a prisoner for ransom by the emperor there. And once again, enormous sums of money had to be raised across England to pay for his release. But finally, King Richard does come home in 1194. And when he does, he takes a very dim view of people who flouted the authority of his chancellor when he was gone. So any nobles who had supported Prince John's rebellion in King Richard's absence were now out of favor with the crown, and this meant Nicola and her husband, amongst many, many others. One of the penalties for that was that they had to give up Lincoln Castle. So Nicola is now removed from this position that's been in her family for so long. Her husband loses his job as sheriff. They're in disgrace. So this period from 1194, when Richard arrives home, to 1199 is the period when Nicola and her husband are out of the castle and out of royal favor, and they also have to pay hefty fines, basically as apology money for their disloyalty. Nicola herself negotiates with King Richard to retain control of organizing her own daughter's marriage. Now, this may seem odd to you. Why would you need to do that? Well, because if you were a noble family, ultimately the king was in charge of approving or even arranging the marriages of your children. He had a say in deciding who you were going to make an alliance with, because he didn't want any noble families becoming too powerful through marriage alliances and posing a threat to his own authority. So Nicola basically negotiates with the king and says, I want to be in charge of marrying off my daughter. I'm going to pay you a huge amount of money to have this privilege. And the king said, yes, you can have it if you pay me the money, so long as you don't arrange your daughter's marriage to anyone who's an enemy of the king. So as long as it's not someone who's known to be treasonous or on the outs with the king, Nicola can be in charge of that. But everything changes in 1199. And this is because King Richard suddenly dies of a poisoned arrow wound. He'd been riding around England, putting down rebellions, fighting nobles on his own land in the wake of things that had gone on in his absence, and someone shot an arrow at him from behind a castle wall, an arrow that had a poisoned tip. And so even though it was a relatively minor wound to the shoulder, the poison on the tip of that ensured that the king became very ill and died soon after. When he died in 1199, Prince John inherits the throne. And this means that those people who have been friends of Prince John are no longer on the outs, they are on the inside. And this means Nicola and her husband. So at this point, they're reinstated to their position as keepers of Lincoln Castle, and their other lands and properties are confirmed. Now, I should note here that John's accession to the crown wasn't entirely a matter of course. In fact, nobles in England debated, because when Richard died, there were two contending candidates. There was his younger brother, John, and there was John's nephew, a youth named Arthur of Brittany. And different nobles had discussions with prominent churchmen in England at the time. Which of these two should be our next king? Eventually, very powerful knights threw their votes in John's favor, and he became the king. But he didn't forget the fact that it could very easily have landed on Arthur instead, and that's going to be important for the events that are about to unfold. So Prince John is now King John as of 1199. And we don't hear much about Nicola for the next 16 years. She resurfaces again in 1215, when her husband Gerard dies. So Gerard has been her second husband, and when he dies, he leaves her with 2 adult sons as a result of that marriage, as well as her adult daughter who was the result of her first marriage. At this point, Nicola is now about 65 years old, no longer a young woman. But 1215 is a momentous year for England as well, and it's been a particularly bad year for King John. Now, King John has been king for 16 years, and these have not been happy years for England. In fact, King John has effectively presided over the ruination of his father's Angevin empire. His father was Henry II, Henry Plantagenet, who during his lifetime had amassed an amount of land that was so large and so wealthy that it exceeded the wealth and land of the King of France himself, who had previously been the recognized, more powerful monarch. So King John has essentially been presiding over the destruction of his father's Angevin empire. His father, Henry II, or Henry Plantagenet, had succeeded in amassing such a large amount of land, not just England, but Normandy and other parts that now belong to France, were under his authority. So Henry's empire was wealthier and larger in landmass than even that of the King of France. And this was an astonishing reversal of power, because up to that point, the King of France had been the dominant monarch in the region. So Henry II succeeds in changing the balance of power in his own favor, building this enormous empire, and then parceling it out amongst his sons. At this point, his 5th son, John, is presiding over the disintegration of that empire. He's watching as the King of France is taking back Normandy and other lands that used to belong to his father. Now, John isn't just sitting on the sidelines watching this. He is making war with the King of France. He is fighting, but he's doing so in a very ineffective and very expensive way. So for the nobles of England, this is a really bad 16-year period. I mean, King John is losing these battles. He's also continuously levying more and more taxes, which are ruinous for the nobility, to pay for these never-ending wars. So financially it's difficult, and then they have other problems with King John. By the time we get to 1215, the barons and nobles of England have had enough. So they demand that King John sign a document that's become known to history as Magna Carta. So in June of 1215, at a place called Runnymede, the barons supposedly meet with King John and they say, you need to sign this document. It's a document that limits the king's power to some degree and says, actually, you can't just do whatever you want. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But essentially, King John signs this document and then turns around and promptly ignores the promises that he signed his name to in that moment. This really shouldn't have surprised anybody. It was already well known that John was utterly untrustworthy, and he also had a very large streak of cruelty. For example, Arthur of Brittany, John's nephew, who could so easily have become king instead of him, well, Arthur of Brittany ends up as a prisoner of King John. Remember, Arthur is his own nephew. And Arthur disappears. He never emerges from King John's dungeons. There are various reports of how he died. Several of them involve King John doing the deed himself. Some stories say that King John threw his nephew off the edge of a cliff. Others say that King John took his nephew out in a rowboat with weights attached and then threw Arthur, who is a very young man, off the edge of the boat into the water to drown. Ultimately, we don't know exactly how Arthur died, but his body was never found, and he was most definitely dead. This was seen as a particularly heinous example of just how ruthless King John could be. I hope none of you listening could even imagine the prospect of murdering a nephew just on the chance that they might take over the family business. But this was essentially what John had done. And it wasn't just the fate of Arthur that had given John a very bad reputation. For example, at one point he had taken 27 hostages from Wales, which was an area that he was having great difficulty subduing. And he eventually hangs all 27 of these hostages, one of whom is a 7-year-old boy. Can you imagine the kind of monster it would take to string up a 7-year-old child? But this is what King John had done. And it didn't stop there. There's another absolutely bone-chilling account of the fate of a noblewoman by the name of Lady Matilda de Breauz. She had married a Norman nobleman who was very close with King John, someone who was a friend of the king and a collaborator even. There are some reports that even say that Matilda's husband was present and witnessed what actually happened to Arthur of Brittany, so he had a reputation for being very much in King John's inner circle. However, Lady Matilda's husband got on King John's bad side, and he did this by missing payments that he owed to the crown in exchange for some lands that the king had granted him in Ireland. Right? So the king says, I, with my authority, I'm going to give you this parcel of land. In exchange, you need to pay me this amount of money. So Matilda's husband had fallen behind on these payments. And the king decides that he's going to make an example of this particular nobleman and his family. So he demands that Lady Matilda and her husband hand over a few of their sons as hostages to be kept by the king to assure that Lady Matilda and her husband will make the remaining payments that they owe. Lady Matilda stands up and says, absolutely not. I'm not handing over my children to you, a man who's murdered his own nephew. Now, the fact that she said this part out loud is entirely understandable from the perspective of a mother who's thinking about the lives of her children, but it was very bad politics. Very bad politics to speak out loud the king's guilt in this matter, which was whispered all over the kingdom, and which Lady Matilda's husband himself might have had eyewitness testimony for. So the king took this very badly, and this means that King John ended up chasing down Lady Matilda and her husband with armed forces. So they were on the run, they were fleeing the king's wrath, and eventually Lady Matilda and one of her sons are cornered, they're arrested by another noble who's loyal to King John, and they're handed over to him as prisoners. So they're now back in the king's keeping. He puts them in a dungeon, and he sends a message to Lady Matilda's husband where he says, yeah, I'll release your wife and your kid in exchange for an exorbitant sum of money. A sum of money that Lady Matilda's husband just could not come up with. And so he ends up fleeing for his life, and this leaves Matilda and her son in the dungeon, where King John deliberately starves them to death. And the report that we have of their corpses when they were found was that Lady Matilda's son had marks on his cheeks where she had resorted to cannibalism to try to stay alive. So it seems as though her son had died first, and she, in desperation, tried to keep herself alive by eating whatever was there. The desperation and the darkness that are involved in this moment where this woman is left to rot in a dungeon and is resorting to eating the flesh on the face of her own child beggars the imagination. And this account went out. It was whispered, it was talked about, and other noble families said, my God, if the king can do this to one of us, to a noblewoman, if he can ruin this family and disinherit them, who is safe? So this was the king that the barons were trying to restrain in 1217 when they forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. Lady Matilda had starved to death a mere 4 years earlier in 1211, so this account was fairly fresh in the memory, and it might have been the reason for Article 39 of the Magna Carta, which reads as follows, quote, "No man shall be taken, imprisoned, outlawed, banished, or in any way destroyed, nor will we proceed against or prosecute him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land." So it's very clear that what the barons are saying here is, you can't do just whatever you want to whomever you want because you're the king. We need some kind of due process here. You can't throw people in dungeons and let them rot, or take their lands, or execute them just because you feel like it. If people break laws, if their guilt is recognized by their peers, then there's a legitimate reason for punishment. But you can't just do whatever you want with people because you wear the crown. And this is a very important moment. Even though King John basically went back on the promises of Magna Carta within months of signing it, this demand is a watershed moment because it says that even kings must be accountable to the rule of law, that nobody can be in a position where they have absolute power. And the fate of Lady Matilda is a cautionary tale about what happens to people when there is absolute power that is unaccountable to any law or anyone else. Now, as I've said, even though King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, he basically ignored these demands within months, and that meant that his barons were now ready for a civil war. They had threatened the civil war to get him to the point where the king would sign this document, and now that he was going to go back on it, they said, okay, if you want a war is what you're going to get. This conflict is known as the First Barons' War, and it went from 1215 to 1217. The goal was to overthrow King John, who was now seen as a tyrant, as someone who was utterly unscrupulous and very dangerous. Now, some of the English nobles went so far as to invite the Prince of France to come over to England and lead the rebellion. This is the son of the King of France that King John has been so busy fighting for the last couple of decades. So it's the ultimate insult in some ways to say, we hate you so much, King John, that we're willing to bring the Prince of France over to wear the crown instead of you. The Prince of France was called Louis, and he was quite tempted by this offer. Prince Louis of France had a reputation for being loyal, pious, and honest. Basically all the things that King John wasn't. And this was the reason that he got this invitation, that he had this reputation. And the English were so desperate for someone who wasn't going to be tyrannical and rapacious that they were willing to take even a Prince of France. So King Louis arrives in England in 1216 with a force of 1,200 knights of his own to join and lead the rebel cause. If they win, he will be the next king of England. Now this raises a very important question. Nicola and her husband Gerard, who's now dead by the way, have been supporters of King John all along. And as I've pointed out, King John was anything but a good man. To put it mildly, he was a very bad man indeed. So does this mean that Nicola and her husband were on the wrong side of history? Well, by the time we get to the First Barons' War, Nicola's husband is dead. So he's out of the picture. And Nicola herself probably wasn't in a position to lead an army. So perhaps she keeps a low profile. But even granting that, we do have to go back and say, well, why would Nicola and her husband have supported John in the first place? Nicola and her husband were not alone. There were a significant number of nobles who remained loyal to King John, even though they personally loathed him. So why? Well, the first factor that would influence this for many noble families would be which king or prospective king is going to be better for our interests personally as a family? Whose rule is going to protect our own property holdings and finances? And in this regard, the recent fate of Lady Matilda in the dungeon was a terrifying reminder of what could happen to noble families who had been friends of King John and then got on his wrong side. So it's entirely reasonable to suppose that a good number of English families thought, this King John is a very scary man and we hate him, but we don't want to stick our necks out because we'd like to keep them firmly attached to our bodies, you know? So perhaps we're just going to lay low and say, yes, we're loyal to the king and we're going to wait this one out. The second factor that nobles would have considered would be stability. Who was going to be more effective at securing the realm, at fending off invasions? Because if there's a war and if there's an invasion, that is ruinous for everybody. A third factor would be which ruler has the strongest rightful claim to wear the crown. And in this regard, John certainly had a stronger position than the Prince of France, although he had some family ties by marriage, as most noble families did, John had direct succession from the previous king. And the fourth factor, which I'm going to introduce perhaps a little bit facetiously, would be which candidate was not French. Because the animosity or the disdain that many English felt for the French, it didn't begin with Chancellor Longchamp. The idea that we would rather have an English king, even if this English king is bad, we can wait him out and the next one will be an English king. If you bring over the Prince of France, England now becomes French property. You're going to have the French ruling you directly. And so surely that would be a factor for some noble families to say, we're not going to side with the rebels, even though we understand their cause and we loathe John personally. And you have to remember that many of these English families, these aristocrats like Nicola and her family, are descended from the nobles who came over from Normandy with William the Conqueror a century before. And they've been witness to this audacious English Plantagenet project of building an empire that is bigger and more powerful than that of the King of France. So if you had generations of your family who were involved in fighting these wars, in fighting the French, in building this England, which was something different, then to hand it all over to Prince Louis at this moment would seem to be spitting in the eye of some generations of your family. Surely there are a number of people who must have thought this way as well, and thought, we hate John, but he's going to die at some point, and then we'll have another English king, and our project here will survive. Of course, the final factor, which was very significant, was that making a French prince the King of England was going to lead to an influx of French nobles, who would naturally want English land for themselves, and they would be expecting their French king to grant it to them at his good pleasure. And that was going to mean a loss of land and revenue for the existing English aristocracy. And when some of the English nobles who'd been inviting the Prince of France realized this, the support for his candidacy began to fall apart, because this was directly in opposition to their own best interests. So it's during this First Barons' War, in the year 1216, right in the middle of it, that Lady Nicola de la Haye comes back into focus. And this is because she is still the keeper of Lincoln Castle. And Lincoln Castle comes under rebel attack in August of 1216. So, as before, Nicola is in charge of overseeing the defenses of the castle, and she successfully defends it against rebel attack. At this point, she's a woman in her mid-60s. So King John and his forces, who Nicola is loyal to, turn up at Lincoln Castle twice in the year 1216. They come once in February and once in September, which coincides very closely with when the rebels leave. So it's possible that the arrival of King John and his forces were the reason that the rebel siege ends at the end of August. Now, there's a report of an exchange that King John has with Nicola personally, and it happens during one of these meetings. We don't know for sure if this was the February meeting or the September one, but I like to think it was September, right after Nicola had proved her value once again by keeping the castle out of rebel hands. Now, the report goes that Nicola met the king in person, and she offered to resign her post as castellan, or keeper of Lincoln Castle. She had the keys in her hand, and she offered them to the king, and she said, "I'm ready to resign." It seems likely that she thought that being in charge of a strategic fortress in the middle of an English civil war was an extremely risky position to be in, and perhaps she would rather retreat and go somewhere quieter. But what's interesting is how the king responds. King John is reported to have said, "My dear Nicola, it is my desire that you continue to keep the castle until I order otherwise." Now, some historians have pointed out that this is a rare occasion of John actually being nice to somebody, but it probably had a lot more to do with strategic considerations than anything else. Nicola had proven herself to be both loyal and effective, and in the middle of a civil war, when a lot of noble families were busy shifting their allegiances back and forth, it was very important to have somebody who had those qualities in charge of such an important castle as Lincoln. Now, only weeks later, in October, King John himself was on his deathbed, and he was dying, as so many people did in an era before antibiotics, of dysentery. In his final hours, the king was busy making a number of appointments and arrangements because he knew his end was near, and he does something quite astonishing. He actually appoints Nicola to even greater responsibilities than the ones she already has. He appoints her to her husband's former post as Sheriff of Lincolnshire. And this is shocking because we don't have any records in England prior to this point of a woman holding the office of sheriff. The role of a sheriff in the 1200s was a very important one. The sheriff was essentially the king's local representative, in charge of enforcing laws and collecting taxes. In time of war, the role of the sheriff was even more important because the sheriff was responsible for keeping his region loyal to the king. And that meant doing things like supervising the transfer of hostages that might be handed over to assure the loyalty of families in that region, or even confiscating land of families found to be disloyal as a punishment. So obviously the sheriff needed to have influence or clout over the families in that region. And we have records of Nicola de la Haye performing all of these duties the very same year, even though she was now in her mid-60s. The Civil War in England continued, even though King John was now dead. The crown was passed to his 9-year-old son, a boy known to history as Henry III, who was clearly not old enough to govern a country effectively. And so the person in charge of being regent or protector of the realm was none other than the legendary knight William Marshal. And for those of you who listen to this podcast regularly, you'll know that we've done a special bonus episode all about the epic life of Sir William the Marshal. So you can go check that out if you'd like to know more about him. But at this point in the story, in 1217, William Marshal's job is to coordinate the military resistance against the rebels in England. And so he's going to be organizing the campaign against Prince Louis and the rebel barons of England. For a third time, Lincoln Castle is under attack. And once again, Lady Nicola is on the front line organizing the defense of the castle. Chroniclers at the time praise her for, quote, acting manfully, or defending the castle like a man. And again, this is a way of saying that she was fully living up to all of the duties that would be expected of any man in this very important defensive position. So the rebel army has surrounded Lincoln Castle. They've taken the neighboring town of Lincolnshire, and they're camped out waiting for reinforcements. Lady Nicola and her garrison are stuck inside the castle, and they are also waiting for reinforcements. And it's at this moment that William Marshal shows up. Now, in case this is the first time you're hearing about William Marshal, let me just tell you that he was a thoroughly amazing individual. He was widely regarded as the most outstanding knight of his generation, with a career that got off to an amazing start. As a newly knighted warrior, at the age of 21, he engaged in a very bloody battle to defend Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, also known as the Queen of England at that point, from an ambush and a kidnapping. He immediately gains her attention for his bravery and his courage, despite being severely wounded. And he goes on to prove himself again and again, not only on the battlefield, but in the extremely dangerous melee tournaments of the 12th and 13th century, which are very much unlike the jousting that we're familiar with from Hollywood films about the Middle Ages. A melee tournament was much more like a pitched battle, with two groups of armed knights riding at each other just as they would on a battlefield, trying to knock each other off their horses and take each other prisoner. It was very similar to a real battle, except that you weren't actually trying to kill anybody, although people did get injured and even killed in these competitions. But William Marshal proves his outstanding skill, his courage, and his daring time and time again, being recognized on these tournament fields as a champion by his peers. He was even appointed to train the Crown Prince of England in martial skills because his own were so impressive. So by every measure, William Marshal is somebody that his contemporaries look up to. And his life goes on to have many other distinguished chapters. But at this point in the story, William Marshal is an old man. He's nearly 70 years old. Apparently, though, he's as fearless and daring as ever. Now, as regent or protector of the realm, he could have given directions to the army and sent somebody else off to this battle to lead the men into combat. But that wasn't William Marshal's style. No, he was going to arrive in person, and he wasn't just going to supervise his men. He wanted to be riding right into the thick of things. So William Marshal shows up with his army, prepared to fight the rebels. And the rebels are camped out in Lincolnshire, or the town next to the castle. So Lincoln Castle is up on a hill next to the upper levels of Lincolnshire town, and then you can go down the hill and there's more of the town below. William Marshal and his troops at this point, before they've gone to fight anybody, receive a very important message, which is there's an old door into Lincoln Castle, kind of a back gate through the wall that will allow them backdoor access into the castle. And this is really important because it's going to allow them to have the element of surprise. So William Marshal sends a few of his men to enter Lincoln Castle through this door, and they take up their positions inside. Lady Nicola, as you can imagine, is absolutely delighted to see them. Having done this, William Marshal then sends the bulk of his forces around to the front entrance to engage the army where they're expected to show up in the town of Lincolnshire itself. So as William is engaging the rebels at the front gate, drawing all their attention in his direction, suddenly from the castle behind them, archers begin to shoot down from the walls at the rebels from behind. And then the castle gates open, and William's secret second force comes charging out of the gate. So now the rebel army are fighting on two fronts. They're fighting William Marshal and his main force in front, but they're suddenly distracted, and this chaotic action going on precisely where they don't expect to find it, from the castle at their rear. Now, William Marshal is so excited to get right into the fray that he nearly rides in without his helmet. His trusty squire grabs hold of his horse's bridle and says, "Not so fast, sire." And he pulls out the helmet and insists that the Lord Protector William Marshal put the helm on his head. And with that, the grizzled old warrior, brandishing his sword, goes right into the thick of things. And he was very effective. William Marshal was extremely good at unhorsing men and cutting them down, even at this point in his life. And there's one man who William Marshal went after in this battle who managed to land 3 very strong blows on William Marshal before he was finally knocked off his horse and killed. And one of those blows was so forceful that it dented William Marshal's helmet. Which means that William probably owed his life that day to his squire, because the chances of surviving a blow strong enough to dent a metal helmet are not so good. Once again, though, Lady Nicola de la Haye had played a key role in this battle. The Battle of Lincoln Castle in 1217 proved to be a turning point in the Civil War. Rebel forces began negotiations for some kind of a settlement or a peace only weeks after this battle. And while those negotiations didn't succeed and things dragged on, the point had been made. This was a key engagement. And the fact that Lady Nicola had managed to keep the castle successfully out of rebel hands, thereby preserving it as a staging ground for this secret assault that William Marshal could then send out of the castle gates, was extremely instrumental in the victory achieved on that day. And this was recognized by English sources at the time. Both William Marshal and the young king, Henry III, publicly recognized the debt of gratitude they owed her. The English remembered Lady Nicola as a worthy lady and prayed for her preservation in body and soul. The French sources, understandably, on the rebel side, remember her a little bit differently. The French described her as a very cunning, bad-hearted, and vigorous old woman, unquote. Now, obviously, these were the bitter words of a defeated enemy, but even in the insults that were intended here, you can see a clear recognition of her intelligence and her energy. While Nicola had very clearly and repeatedly proved her value and her competence, she was nevertheless occupying a position that was usually filled by a man, and so it was only a matter of time before a man came along and tried to take it from her. That man was the Earl of Salisbury, and he was going to be the father-in-law of Lady Nicola's granddaughter. This is a little bit complicated, so bear with me. The Earl of Salisbury got a lot of his clout from the fact that he was actually the uncle of the boy king Henry III. But, as I've said, he was also about to be part of Nicola's family. As was the case with many noble families in England at this time, the marriage had been negotiated years before. Lady Nicola's adult son had a daughter, and this daughter was going to inherit all of his land and property because he died without any other heirs. The Earl of Salisbury's son, who was also a minor, like Lady Nicola's granddaughter at the time, was going to marry Nicola's granddaughter. So the Earl would be Lady Nicola's granddaughter's father-in-law. It's very confusing, but the upshot of it all is this. The two young people weren't even married yet, but the marriage had been agreed to by both families, and so the Earl of Salisbury regarded the marriage itself as a mere formality. What he saw was that everything Lady Nicola had, and everything her son had, was going to be inherited by this granddaughter, who was going to be marrying into his family. And because his own son was still a minor, that basically meant, from the Earl of Salisbury's point of view, that all of that stuff, all of that property, all of that wealth belonged to him. And so he thought, well, why wait for an old lady to die? Why wait for this marriage to be formalized? All of this stuff essentially has my name on it. It's coming into my family. So why not take possession of it now? Only 4 days after the Battle of Lincoln Castle, the Earl of Salisbury managed to get himself declared Sheriff of Lincolnshire, thereby displacing Nicola, who, remember, had been acting as the Sheriff of Lincolnshire since King John gave her that position just before he died. So the Earl is already edging Lady Nicola out of one of the roles that she holds. He then tries to take the castle from her as well. Now, at this point, Lady Nicola is outraged. She's not having it. So she actually travels to the royal court, she protests, and she succeeds in getting the Earl of Salisbury rebuked. The Earl was told to hand back the castle, the city, and the post of sheriff. So he needed to get his hands off Nicola's stuff. But this only lasted 7 months before the Earl somehow managed to get himself back into the position of sheriff. Nicola still held the castle, though, but the Earl of Salisbury wasn't going to be put off. 2 years later, in 1219, he again tried to seize Lincoln Castle by force. He brought armed men, and he tried to forcibly take it away. So now, for the 4th time, Lady Nicola is again in the position of leading the defense of Lincoln Castle, digging in with the garrison, and waiting for royal reinforcements. She'd sent messages to the king, she let him know what was going on, and she was determined not to let go of the castle until a royal army came to her relief. And they did. The king once again ordered the Earl of Salisbury to, quote, "respect our beloved and faithful Nicola de la Haye," unquote. But the Earl was a persistent man. He tried again only the next year, this time by persuasion, to try to get Nicola to voluntarily give up her castle to him. But Lady Nicola resolutely refused, and she continued to live in Lincoln Castle and be the castellan of that fortress for another 6 years. 3 months after the Earl of Salisbury died, in June of 1226, Lady Nicola finally decided that perhaps it was time to retire from being keeper of Lincoln Castle. It must have been no small satisfaction to her that she'd managed to stand toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful men in the realm and resist his attempts to edge her into obscurity and to take from her the things that were hers by right. She'd managed to maintain control of her castle and her family inheritance. Lady Nicola de la Haye was a woman who survived a chaotic and dangerous period in English history, including a civil war. She repeatedly proved herself both skillful and brave, as well as loyal. She refused to be intimidated by men who expected her to move aside and surrender. Her life is a testimony to resourcefulness and courage in a world that expected women to be invisible. I hope you've enjoyed this bonus episode on the life of Lady Nicola de la Haye. Thank you so much for being a supporter of Villains and Virgins podcast and for being with me here on this episode. I'll see you in the next one.